Hello and welcome to Ctrl-Alt-Speech. As we mentioned in last week's episode, we do not have a regular episode for you this week because it is Thanksgiving here in the US. But we do have something special for you instead. It is one of our sponsored Spotlight episodes in which we get to go deep with an expert in the trust and safety field and have a really interesting, thought-provoking conversation. This week, the Spotlight is brought to you by Resolver, talking about how they've just reached their 20th anniversary supplying trust and safety services, which really is kind of incredible given just how drastically the internet world has changed over the last 20 years. In this episode, Ben got to sit down with George Vlasto, who's the head of Resolver's Trust and Safety Division, to talk about their unique approach to scaling the detection of child sexual abuse material, better known as CSAM. They reminisce on how much the online world has changed in these past 20 years, as well as talk about how Resolver's latest innovation, called ATHENA, is an incredibly powerful tool in the fight against online harms. Please enjoy this Spotlight episode with Ben and George Vlasto from Resolver.
George, welcome to Ctrl-Alt-Speech. Thanks so much for joining me today, and thanks again to Resolver for sponsoring the podcast and making Mike and I's weekly jabberings possible. We're going to dive straight in and talk a bit about Resolver Trust and Safety, which is a company that's been around a long time. It's been around 20 years. This week, in fact. For people who are new to the company, who maybe weren't paying attention back in 2005, tell us a bit about Resolver, what it does in the space.
Thanks, Ben, and thank you for having me on the podcast. It's a pleasure to be with you today. As you say, we are celebrating our 20th anniversary this week, which is a huge milestone for us. 20 years is almost an eternity in technology. And I was talking to our founder, Adam Hildreth, the other day, and we were reflecting on the earliest days of Resolver, the sort of early days of the social internet. And really, the journey we've been on from being at the cutting edge of discovering these kind of emerging harms, which at the time were really not well understood or well thought through, and the sort of earliest bad actors operating in places where vulnerable users congregated, particularly children, and how we started really in the early days, quite a sort of scrappy, largely through a keyword-based effort to identify problematic behavior, and how that's evolved over 20 years. And now we have data scientists and risk detection engineers working with our human specialists to be able to detect not just problematic content, but behavior, tradecraft, as we call it, the sort of methodology that bad actors use, all the way up to our kind of latest product launch, which is our unknown CSAM detection service. And it's an extraordinary number of people who've played a part in that. A whole range of disciplines, from some people with academic backgrounds through to deep data scientists, engineers, and everyone in between. And it's pretty remarkable, actually, to reflect on that 20-year journey.
Yeah, indeed. There's very few companies have been around for that length of time. Many have come and gone. I think Resolver interesting for a number of reasons. You're not your kind of typical product-driven company. You address a range of harms, as you've alluded to there, rather than just one. You have lots of different expertise kind of underneath the Resolver umbrella. Can you talk a bit about how you've, as a company, developed to cover all of these harms and with this broad range of expertise? Because I think it is fairly unique.
It is. We have the great advantage, I think, in this space that, unlike a lot of our clients and partners, the only thing we think about is trust and safety. So for even the most sophisticated of our clients, trust and safety is a component. It's an important component, but it's a component part of what their overall organization thinks about. For us, it's everything, which has allowed us to be, although we do have product and product management function, we are actually problem focused. And I think that's the kind of our ethos ever since our earliest days in 2005. Problems evolve, problems emerge, both through human behavior and technology innovation, and being nimble enough to respond to those in a kind of dynamic way has been pretty key to our success thus far. And also, I think, is a reflection or is reflected in the fact that we have this very diverse group of skills and people globally now in 4 or 5 different countries operating kind of 24/7. And it's about being problem focused rather than having a product that we're trying to market for its own sake. It's about constantly adapting our approach to fix the problem or address the problem that our clients and partners are struggling with at that given moment in time.
Yeah, great. That's really helpful. You mentioned when you explained Resolver about its focus on behaviors and kind of identifying harmful behaviors as much as kind of harmful content. And there is an emphasis on intelligence and intelligence-led approach. What does that mean in practice? And how does Resolver think about the balance of not only kind of human intelligence, but also increasingly AI intelligence too?
That's a really good question. And I think the advent of AI at huge scale with remarkable capabilities obviously has changed the way that we address this problem, actually. So the way we think about it is there are emerging threats, emerging behaviors, sometimes in the context of new regulations or new regulatory requirements that our clients and partners are required to think about. And being able to understand the risk on your platform or your service and how that compares to others and also interacts with the sort of regulatory framework in which you're operating is really important. And that is still, and I can't see a world in which it's not in the future, driven by human expertise, deep subject matter expertise that enables us to act in a, almost a consultative way with our partners to help them understand the risks that they might be facing and how those are evolving. AI is obviously a really important part, and almost all of our partners use their own internal AI or AI that they bring in for the job to detect harm at scale as sort of classifiers. And a lot of what we're doing with our human expertise is informing those classifiers and helping them operate at the kind of highest level of efficiency possible to drive real value to the companies that we work with. In one case in particular, it's very hard for our partners to train their own models, and that's in CSAM detection, which is why we brought to market what we call ATHENA, which is our sort of best-in-class new generation CSAM detection service. And that's kind of our unique AI offering, a machine learning model that can solve that problem for you in a way that your own classifiers can't, because you just can't train them on that kind of material. So it's humans informing policy, training classifiers, and then in the hardest and most egregious harm, in the case of CSAM, us actually providing a solution directly to our partners rather than leaving them to sort of fumble in the dark around a very, very challenging, legally, ethically, and psychologically challenging kind of issue.
Yeah, great to hear more about that. We're going to talk a bit about ATHENA shortly, but I want to kind of talk a bit about you and your part in Resolver's journey over the last 20 years. You had a 15-year career in the UK diplomatic service, and you've been in the role at Resolver as head of trust and safety for 3 years now. Talk us about that transition from UK government service into this role, and give us a sense of what your kind of day-to-day looks like in the broader Resolver machine.
Yeah, so I sort of went into public service and diplomacy because I wanted to work on, some of the most challenging, consequential issues that there were, and I was lucky to do that in various parts of the world. But it became pretty clear to me a few years ago that actually the sort of generational challenge that we as a society, and global society, not just in the UK or just in sort of Western countries, have to grapple with is online harm, how we harness the power of the internet, which is obviously exponentially improved, communication, academic collaboration, in some cases political freedom, and how do we balance that against the harm, especially to vulnerable users, particularly children. So for a number of years, I was looking for an opportunity to move across, and then I was very fortunate to find this opportunity at Resolver. So it was actually oddly, psychologically quite a natural transition, although it's a very different job than what I was doing before. So my day at the moment really entails creating space for our team. So as I said at the beginning, our strength comes from our ability to understand quickly and respond rapidly to emerging problems. And the only way we can do that is by having teams who are enabled to be pretty entrepreneurial actually in their own areas, obviously, within a structure. So my basic job is to make space for our engineering teams, or our risk detection teams, or our human intelligence specialists to focus on what they need to have the tools at their disposal, to have the resources and the sort of framework to operate within, which enables them to respond really quickly on behalf of our clients and partners to these problems, which can come out of nowhere. We can see these things, particularly as harm verticals merge together. We see different manifestations. We sit with comm networks at the moment. You need to be very, very agile to be able to respond to those kind of effectively. So that's really my job, is to try and create the framework that enables agility. And that's harder said than done, I think.
For sure. Just explain to us what you mean there by comm network, because there might be listeners who don't fully understand what that means.
So I think this kind of emerging trend, this blending of nihilistic sort of ideology, suicide and self-harm risk, extortion, sextortion in some cases, these really nasty groups like 764 coming to the fore, who don't fall neatly, no one falls neatly in any case, but doesn't fall neatly into any of the traditional harm verticals that most of our partners and most of the industry look at, whether it's child safety or sextortion or suicide and self-harm. And they cut across, they're using new techniques, they're sometimes interoperable with organized crime and money laundering. these are really, really complex challenges that have emerged very rapidly and even have kind of major law enforcement agencies kind of on the back foot trying to respond to them. They sit somewhere outside of the kind of regulatory framework in some cases. And a lot of our partners are extremely keen, obviously, to understand how these groups operate, how they manifest on their platforms, the kind of behaviors they're using and the risk they pose to their users. And that's one of those kind of examples where really that's a kind of almost a kind of war room of people at Resolver who will come together, look at this from different angles and try and develop a solution to the problem that enables our partners to get ahead of it before it starts to really damage the well-being of the users on their platforms.
Yeah, interesting. You mentioned needing to respond quickly to the problems and issues that partners bring to you. Can you give an example that kind of sticks in your mind from the time you've been at Resolver so far, where that's been particularly stark, or you've had to kind of move particularly quickly, or try to address harm maybe that you never saw coming?
Yeah, so I'll give you a couple of examples. It's slightly different. So one was we were working with one of our partners on suicide and self-harm prevention, and detected by our technology and then reviewed by analysts in pretty much real time, we saw an indication that a school-aged individual was planning to go to their school and, at least according to their social media post, take their own life. We saw that in real time. Obviously, we alerted our partner to that, but we also in parallel alerted law enforcement in the jurisdiction to which this applied, who were able to intervene in that individual's kind of journey to school, and were able to offer that person psychological support and ensure that they weren't able to go through with their plan, which had been sort of fueled by some of their exposure to material online. That's, we actually see that relatively frequently, that kind of very, very rapid response to a threat online, where we can work with our partners, work with law enforcement or other kind of social organizations to intervene, to stop things happening. And it's obviously incredibly powerful when it happens. It kind of resonates through the whole business, or people who know about it within the business, because it's such an acute demonstration of what we do, particularly when it's at that individual scale. So that'd be one example. And then another, which we had recently, where I think we benefit sometimes when we work with our partners, because we don't just look at our partners' platforms, we also look around them, the ecosystem around them. And in one particular case recently, there was an individual who was posing a risk to children on our partners' platform, but their activity on our partners' platform was policy violative, but not illegal. And they were able to circumvent some of the countermeasures that were put in place to try and stop them using the platform. But using our sort of off-platform research, we could see this person actually posed a real-world threat to children. It was quite clear they were engaged in illegal activity and soliciting illegal activity elsewhere. So we were able to work in coordination with our partner to pass that information we had to law enforcement in the location that person was in, and then they were able to take appropriate action. So, in one case, sort of helping somebody who was potentially a victim of suicide and self-harm, or suicide and self-harm material that they've been exposed to, and on the other, looking to take action against a potential perpetrator of child exploitation. So those kind of examples, actually occur on a remarkably regular basis, actually.
And so kind of acting as the kind of eyes of a platform or a partner in other spaces on the internet, perhaps where that partner or that platform might not have visibility. Is that fair to say?
Exactly, yeah. And sometimes they may not even have the latitude to act on information, elsewhere, because they haven't collected it, they haven't seen it, but also because it sits outside of their ecosystem. Whereas we can sort of act as that intermediary sometimes with law enforcement or social support agencies or something if intervention is required.
And so many of the stories that Mike and I talk on the podcast feel like they start on one platform, emanate to another, move to another. And so that is definitely a kind of thread in many of the stories we discuss. And as I'm sure you're aware, we're going to talk today, George, in a bit more detail about ATHENA and about child sexual abuse material, which you touched on. And again, it crops up all too frequently in the podcast each week. Its kind of proliferation as an online harm has seemingly only kind of increased over time. I'd love your thoughts on the landscape of child sexual abuse material now and how that has evolved over time. Are we seeing it get worse in the way that it feels like? What's your sense?
So I think in terms of scale, certainly. In terms of severity, I think that's hard to say. That's a somewhat subjective call to make. But certainly in terms of scale it is. And the way it manifests, the different environments that we're seeing it on increasingly are really concerning. And the advent of generative AI clearly has supercharged the problem. And I think there's a misperception in some quarters that CSAM that's generated using artificial intelligence is a kind of victimless crime. There is a huge body of academic and social research that suggests that's a fallacy. And actually it is, equally problematic and can lead to further offending from child predator communities. And also, I mean, just fundamentally is treated in most jurisdictions as being equally illegal and egregious as real world CSAM. So yeah, it is definitely getting bigger in scale. It's becoming more prevalent in more places on the internet. And I think that child predators or consumers of CSAM are becoming more expert actually at how they generate, disseminate, and crucially monetize this kind of stuff. And that's really kind of one of the biggest changes over the last 3 or 4 years. And we've discussed this extensively with the likes of the IWF and InHope and other partners. How do we tackle this monetization of child sexual exploitation material and CSAM in particular? Because it's a growing problem and financial drivers only exacerbate what was previously a kind of more or less entirely sexual crime.
Yeah. For listeners who maybe kind of don't come across child sexual abuse material and maybe aren't familiar with it, can you just talk about how platforms and at Resolver you would identify child sexual abuse material if it kind of came through a moderation queue or a system? Because again, I think there are a few important distinctions there just to outline before we talk a bit about how you're using your ATHENA tool to mitigate it.
Sure. So there are kind of a number of basic ways to detect CSAM material. So the simplest is human review. So a human being looking at an image and saying, this is CSAM. That can either be a moderator, like working within queues for a platform or technology service, or increasingly user reporting as more and more platforms have implemented sophisticated user reporting mechanisms, but it ultimately revolves around a person looking at it. The second way, which is kind of fairly embedded now across the industry, is what's called known CSAM detection, so hash matching. So any image that's submitted to, for example, NECMEC or the Internet Watch Foundation or others is hashed, so it's given a digital signature. It's then shared with partners. So whenever that image reappears in the ecosystem, a platform should be able to call out against a hash database and get a confirmation that this image that's come through your platform is known to be child sexual abuse material, therefore it must be removed and reported and so on and so forth. And then the final way, which hopefully will lead us onto a conversation about ATHENA, is what's called unknown CSAM detection. So using machine learning technology at scale to identify and detect previously unseen or novel child sexual abuse material, whether it's real world CSAM from real world abuse or CSAM that's been generated using artificial intelligence, but crucially that's never been seen before.
And my understanding, George, is that a lot of the kind of child sexual abuse material that is on platforms is unknown or unmatched. And so there is, basically a kind of iceberg above the water of, material that is known, is in the database and therefore is matched. But there's this kind of vast amount underneath the surface that databases haven't seen before, therefore platforms can't detect. Can you explain what that means in practice for platforms and how that maybe changes how trust and safety teams deal with it and even, refer to it to law enforcement as well?
Yes, so I'd agree completely with what you just said, which is that the proportion of known versus unknown CSAM is sadly heavily weighted in favor of unknown CSAM. So the vast majority of CSAM that exists online has previously never been seen before, or certainly not recorded in a hash database. So effectively, you have a real constraint on your ability to detect child sexual abuse material, either because you've only got a limited number of people that you can deploy to human review. You can't human review every single image or item on your platform at tens of billions, hundreds of billions of items scale. And if you're just relying on known CSAM hash matching, you're only going to be catching a very small proportion, as you say, that top of the iceberg that's been seen before. And even relatively small changes to those images, the signature of those images can throw off known CSAM detection as well. So at the moment, or historically, it's been a really significant challenge for platforms and for law enforcement to detect novel CSAM and also to be able to differentiate between the different grades or different levels of CSAM, the most severe of which might indicate an imminent harm or ongoing harm to a child, that therefore law enforcement may want to prioritize their efforts in targeting or investigating.
And just explain for listeners, George, if you can, that those gradings, because I was almost unaware that there were different types of child sexual abuse material in terms of severity. And again, that's helpful, I guess, as a kind of when we come to talk about ATHENA.
Yeah, and I'll be a bit cautious about how I describe it because I don't want to go sort of too far into the dark heart of this for your listeners. But effectively, that in most jurisdictions, child sexual abuse material is broken down into different categories. In the United States, category 1 through 3. In the United Kingdom and other jurisdictions, it's A to C. C being the least egregious category. That's still sexual content involving a minor, but it's the least egregious. Category A is the most egregious, and I won't describe exactly what those categories contain, but I imagine with a leap of imagination, your listeners can work that out. But category A is generally speaking the word that is generally treated as the most egregious and attracts the most severe criminal penalties if you are obviously creating it or sharing it or disseminating it in any way.
So let's go on to Athena now. I mean, this is a new tool that Resolver is bringing to the market. How did it come about? What does it do? And how does it differ from those other kind of technologies that exist right now and which platforms utilize?
So again, we thought about this from the perspective of the problem rather than the kind of product, as I was describing earlier. So the problem for anyone trying to develop an unknown CSAM classification tool is that in order to develop a computer vision model, you ideally have access to a database of images. So if you're training a machine learning classifier to differentiate between different breeds of dogs, for example, you would feed the machine learning model however many millions of pictures of a Labrador versus a poodle until the model could determine between the two of them. It is illegal to hold a database of child sexual abuse material. Therefore, you can't apply, in most cases, that methodology to training a CSAM detection model. There are technical ways around it. So you can train a model to recognize similar signatures of images. So you can train a model based on those hash databases I was talking about before and look for what's called an embedding model, look for kind of similarities in signature once the image has been hashed, but it's relatively imperfect, that model. And it's not a true computer vision model. So we knew this was a huge and growing problem, the proliferation of CSAM online. The technology that was being deployed against unknown CSAM was not as effective as it could be because of this kind of legal and ethical constraint around CSAM database images. So we decided we were going to try and find a way to solve that problem. And we therefore partnered with a company called Rogue Manor Research, who are our partner in delivering this, who do a lot of work with, in this case, the UK government. And we discovered that the UK government held a database called CADE, the Child Abuse Imagery Database, to which law enforcement and organizations such as the IAAF contribute images. And it's a off-system database. It's not connected to the internet. You need to have a very high level of security clearance to get anywhere near it. But we were able to work with Rogue and the Home Office to get access to that database to train a true computer vision model on the world's most highly curated database of child sexual abuse imagery, which seems like an odd thing to say, but it's the sort of highest quality database that exists in the world because it's all been reviewed so many times. And as a result, we were able to spend a considerable amount of time and development effort to train what is by a considerable margin the most accurate detection system for unknown child sexual abuse because it's actually been trained on real images of child sexual abuse under a very strict ethical and legal framework governed by the UK Home Office in this case, so the UK Interior Ministry for some of your listeners.
Interesting. We'll come on to the testing that you've been doing with Athena, but I'm interested in that kind of security aspect. You know, access to CADE is not something that gets given to many partners, I'm sure. I'd love just to kind of know how that came about, and also how you made sure to kind of protect your teams as they had access to this from a kind of personal standpoint, but also obviously from a security perspective as well.
Well, so those people who had access to CADE and retain access to CADE on an ongoing basis to make sure the model is retrained regularly all have very high level of government security clearances. So they have to have kind of passed what's called a vetting process to be allowed to go anywhere near that database. That's not everyone in Resolver or at Rogue, but a small number of people are able to do that. But even those people don't have to look at the images. So they're able to access the data to train the machine learning model, but they don't have to look at the images because fortunately for us, and unfortunately, I guess, for child protection, police officers and the IAAF, other people who are extremely expert in this have already looked at those images and graded them. So our team don't actually need to view the images themselves. They just need to have access to the data to feed through the model. And it's actually only the model that looks at the image, not our staff. But it's a pretty complex ethical and legal process to go through. And obviously it has to be done under very, very strict guidelines and supervision to ensure that nobody is exposed to data that they don't need to see of the most egregious type, and that no one who shouldn't be seeing or having access to this data is allowed to. It's probably the most complicated commercial pathway that I've ever had to sort of chart through.
Yeah, I'm sure. Many sign-offs. So to kind of summarize, I guess, what Athena does, it provides that categorization of CSAM in a way that has previously been very difficult to do with the data that's been available. What's your expectation of what that will allow platforms to do once they have access to that?
So when we say ATHENA, so there's two sort of parts to this. So there's ATHENA as the unknown CSAM detection model, which is based on a machine learning model called Vigil AI. So platforms that already have a sophisticated trust and safety workflow and known CSAM detection in place and human moderation in place, effectively it becomes just a plugin in the middle of that. So you can run your data through a known CSAM detection database, which is still valuable. And anything which comes back, you can obviously take as read that it's CSAM, or at least it's been flagged as CSAM. Anything that doesn't appear on that database, you can run through ATHENA for an indication that it might contain unknown CSAM. And then there's potentially a human review element at the end of that and reporting requirements to NECMEC and other reporting bodies. So that's for sort of sophisticated trust and safety teams. That's the kind of most likely use case, either through an API call to our infrastructure, or in certain cases, we can deploy this on premises for the kind of biggest technology companies, if that's what they require. But for smaller outfits or people or companies that are thinking about this perhaps for the first time and don't have those sophisticated workflows, ATHENA as a whole can provide all three components of that. So effectively, if you're grappling with the challenge of CSAM on your platform and you have no existing measures in place, we can provide for you in a single workflow known CSAM detection, unknown CSAM detection, and even human review of that CSAM and reporting at the end of it. So for a platform that wants to deal with the problem but doesn't have the resources or potentially the kind of the wherewithal to set up their own workflows, that they can essentially outsource it to us, and we will take care of that entire problem for them to the highest possible standard that exists at the moment, with the technology that's available to us.
Yeah, interesting. You mentioned, George, that you've been testing with a number of different kind of platforms so far. You talked about the accuracy of ATHENA and the models that underpin it. Can you talk a bit about that accuracy relative to other technologies that are available, and also kind of what you've learned in deploying the models in these new scenarios?
Sure. The kind of detailed accuracy scores for Vigil are slightly sensitive. So if any of your listeners are interested in finding out more about it, then please do get in touch and we can share those details under sort of legal protection. But in principle, when ATHENA is deployed kind of in the wild or in a live environment with our customers and clients, it achieves a level of accuracy as close to perfect as you can really achieve with like a machine learning model. However, your second part of your question was how have we learned that this works in a live environment? And it depends on what a platform or a technology service is looking to achieve, because with any machine learning model, there are two variables. There are basically two dials that you can turn. One is called precision and the other is recall. If you dial up precision to the highest level, you will get almost no false positives, but you may miss some edge cases, particularly AI generated imagery that might not be sort of normal imagery, that maybe involves like non-humanoid characters, for example, and things like that. Precision set at a very high level, you may miss some of those edge cases, but you will get pretty much no false positives. If you turn up recall, you're likely to get a higher number of false positives, still not a huge number, but a higher number of false positives, but you will miss like none of those edge cases. So effectively what we say to our clients is like, what are you aiming for? You're aiming for incredibly high precision, perhaps because you've got vast quantities of data, and high false positive rates cost you a huge amount as a business to review and to triage. So you turn up precision, or are you looking to remove any hint of child sexual abuse material from your platform, in which case you prioritize recall. And then the other thing which we've learned is that categorization from A to B to C is really important, because it allows focused attention, referrals to law enforcement, alerting to NECMEC and other organizations to happen to the most egregious harm really, really fast. And it enables our clients to route that kind of content to very highly trained and protected teams. Because one of the other problems is obviously CSAM being viewed by normal moderators who don't have psychological support around them is incredibly traumatic. So if you get a really clear indication at the beginning that this is a deeply egregious image, you can route it in the right way. You can treat it with the urgency it requires and the sensitivity that it requires. So it's seen by the right person really quickly, and then action is taken as fast as possible. So those are the kind of principal things that we've learned as we've kind of rolled it out.
And do you expect, George, as maybe platforms increase the dial on recall in order to comply with kind of regulations and obviously protect children and users that are kind of vulnerable, do you expect that false positive increase to be also an issue the platforms have to deal with as well? Because that's something we see in other harms as an ongoing problem, is that spike in maybe false positives.
Yeah, and I actually think this is a question for regulators as well as for platforms, because most regulation, all regulation, is really predicated on the idea that platforms and technology service providers should take all reasonable efforts to find and mitigate harm. If by setting your recall aperture so wide, whether it's ATHENA or any other type of like machine learning detection system, you're generating a huge amount of noise in your system and you're incurring unreasonable cost or unreasonable interferences with user experience. Clearly, that's not in the spirit of the regulation. So I think there's a dynamic conversation that needs to take place between technology companies themselves and the regulators about, what is reasonable. And I think it will be context dependent. And certainly, when you listen to Ofcom or you listen to the European Commission or the Australian Safety Commissioner's Office or other global regulators, there is a real sense that discretion is required. There's no one size fits all. For a very, very large online platform or a technology service provider, those thresholds might be different than for a kind of emerging technology platform that perhaps is catering, explicitly for children, for example. So I think regulators will take a reasonable approach to it. And I think each platform will have to determine for themselves, what reasonable looks like in that context.
Yeah, most certainly. George, it's fascinating to hear a bit about ATHENA. I wanted to kind of broaden out before we wrap up today around some of the excellent blog posts that Resolve has put out over the last few weeks as it celebrated its 20th birthday. One of them talks about kind of predictive online safety technology. And I wondered whether you thought, in the context of our discussion today, whether we're moving towards a future where models can actually anticipate harms before they occur. Is there a world you can imagine that happening?
I think in certain cases, maybe. I guess it depends on how philosophical you get about what AI is designed to do. But artificial, even the most sophisticated AI models are statistical probability models. So their expertise lies in predicting the most likely next thing at the end of the day, like at its most simple level. And obviously what we know from online safety, but actually outside of just kind of digital safety in the world in general, sometimes the most damaging things are those that are unpredicted, the kind of black swan events that come along, or the really unexpected evolution in human behavior or interest or misuse of technology. So I do think that AI models will get better at learning, and classifiers, generally speaking, will be closer to the margin. But until we reach depending on what your viewpoint is, a halcyon or terrifying future of general artificial intelligence, I think that kind of human guidance of where AI is focused, the training data sets that they're predicated on, and that kind of empathic, like human understanding of how people are actually behaving in real life will remain a really, really important part of the mix. So obviously we'll see incremental gains in AI, but I don't think in any foreseeable future, unforeseeable in tech terms is like 1 year. I don't think AI will ever be a panacea for trust and safety teams.
Yeah, fascinating. That's a fairly reassuring and hopeful note to end our conversation on, George. Really enjoyed talking to you today. We'll share some of the resources and a link to ATHENA and also the blog post that Resolver has put out over the last few weeks in the show notes of today's episode. Just want to say thanks so much for your time today and for sharing a bit more about what Resolver does and what ATHENA is set up to do. Really excited to see how that goes.
Thanks, Ben. It's great to talk today, and thank you for the opportunity to come on the podcast and talk a little bit about Resolver.
Brilliant. Take care. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Ctrl-Alt-Speech. Subscribe now to get our weekly episodes as soon as they're released. If your company or organization is interested in sponsoring the podcast, contact us by visiting Ctrl-Alt-Speech.com. That's Ctrl-Alt-Speech.com.